Здравствуйте, and welcome to what's going to be the first of a series of vlogs on the Soviet Union breadth topic. We're going to start today by considering a little bit of the background to the Russian Revolution, the revolution itself, and Marx's theory about history, which underpins the communism ideology. None of this really is stuff that you'll get asked specific questions on in the exam, but it's helpful kind of backdrop to understand both what Lenin got up to in that 1917 to 21 period and a little bit beyond, but also some of the ideological stuff later on. So let's start off with a few general brushstrokes about Russia. Russia is huge. And it's worth remembering that all the way through the course. And it's very diverse, although we think perhaps of European Russia, there are a load of different nationalities within the Russian Empire before the First World War, what becomes the Soviet Union after the First World War, and then on through the rest of our course. And also different religions too, that although, again, we think of Orthodox Christianity as being representative of Russia and to a lesser extent the Soviet Union in terms of religion, but actually there are a big Muslim minority, particularly in Central Asia. At the time before the First World War, Russia was also economically very backwards, and this won't be a surprise for those of you that have already been through the course and have learned about the industrialization programs of particularly of Stalin, which start almost from scratch. That Russia before the First World War was a very unindustrialized society. And at that stage, it was ruled over by the Tsar, or the Emperor. Tsar Nicholas II was leader in the run-up to the First World War. And he had almost complete power over the country. There had been attempts to reduce his power. There had been ongoing campaigns and agitation and protest for reform. These had reached such a fever pitch back in 1905 that the Tsar had actually given up some of his powers. He'd created a representative parliament called the Duma, D-U-M-A, which had some powers. He'd given some civil rights to groups as well. But in the years after that, rather than that being the start of a process bringing about more democracy, actually the Tsar had reasserted his control. So going to the First World War, he is in complete charge of what happens. At the start of the First World War, Russia intervenes to support its ally Serbia in the Balkans against Austria-Hungary, and then gets sucked into the war, obviously, against Germany, on the side, nominally, of Britain and France. But it is on the side of Britain and France, but of course they can't ally up and work together. Russia is very much in the east, and stays there and fights the war very much on that front. Things don't go too well for Russia at the start. There are several important victories by the Germans, and they advance into Russian territory. And as a result, the Tsar makes probably quite a fateful decision, which is that he decides in 1915 to take control of the army himself. Now, this would have worked out wonderfully if the army had then turned things round and won glorious victories. The Tsar would have been, shoulder high, paraded through St. Petersburg, Petrograd, as it was called at that stage. But of course, it doesn't. The army is not capable of fighting and winning those victories, partly because it lacks equipment. It lacks modern equipment because Russia is unindustrialized. Another impact of the war, which is very important, is that as agricultural workers are taken from the lands and put into the army, food production declines. And so by the latter stages of the war, 1916-17, food supply issues are growing and are severe in places. What this all means is that the Tsar's popularity, which is always a bit fragile, plummets during the First World War. And as a result, in early 1917, he is forced to abdicate. So, start of 1917, he abdicates, and a provisional government is put in place. This government is, the idea is going to be to replace the Tsar with a democratically elected parliament, Duma, which will run the country. And in the interim, this government will oversee that process through to elections. However, at that stage, in 1917, the Provisional Government does take power, and through 1917, it is in charge of running Russia and carrying on with the war. And of course, it struggles enormously to do that because the problems aren't just the Tsar, the problems are much bigger than the Tsar. And so Lenin, who had been abroad, comes back to Russia and begins to campaign using those three simple words: peace, we need to get out of the First World War, nothing's going to be fixed until then; land, the peasants were literally peasants. They had no land of their own. They had to work other people's land. They said, we're not going to solve anything until the peasants have their own land. And bread, we're all hungry and we need the supply of bread to be sorted out. So peace, land, bread becomes this rallying cry and reason that Lenin and the Bolshevik Party are able to gain some popularity and notoriety. And then they launched their own revolution in October 1917, which seizes power. Just a word or two about Lenin. Lenin had been born in 1870. He was a lawyer. He joined the Social Democratic Party in his youth, and he'd become a Marxist. So, in fact, let's branch off Lenin and talk a little bit about Marx. So, Marx had been writing in the mid 19th century, sort of 60, 70 years before the Russian Revolution, and he'd written for quite a while. Mostly in Germany. He'd also come over to England, and he had a theory about how history is working. He looked back at the past and said, way back in history, we were hunter-gatherers and we worked collaboratively, and there was no hierarchy. No one was the boss, and no one was the worker, and no one was the king or the aristocrat, and no one was the peasant. That we were all equal. And then we went through a phase of history called feudalism, where a king was appointed and an aristocracy, nobility put in place, and knights underneath them, and peasants were at the bottom, and they were oppressed. As time went on, the countries grew and expanded and modernized, and they developed capitalism. And once capitalism had taken hold, the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, who owned businesses and traded and manufactured goods, they began to hanker after a slice of power and authority for themselves. And so they enacted a revolution where they would get control. And that's the stage where you see monarchs become constitutional and the nobility and aristocracy kind of fade out of the political background. Eventually, Marx said what will happen, though, is that because the workers are at the bottom, they're working away in factories and they get paid hardly anything and their conditions are terrible. Eventually, these people, what he called the proletariat, the urban workers, will organize themselves together. They're living next door to each other, and they'll come out and they'll be on the streets, and they will bring about a revolution where the workers take control of the factories, and the manufacturing plants and the power stations, and they take control, therefore, of the country. He did say, in a kind of oblique way, that the bourgeoisie, the ruling classes, will resist that, and so the proletariat will need to be firm in making sure that it happens and that it sticks. That the upper classes, the richer classes, don't fight back against it, have a counter-revolution. But the proletariat, the working class, will seize control of power, and that will be socialism. And over time, that will develop. They'll have put in a firm government to start with, but over time, that will develop into communism, where we will all work together. We'll do something over here, and we'll give it to these people over here, and they'll give us something in return, and we'll all be collaborative. And eventually, we won't need any governments, and no one again will be the boss, and no one will be the worker, and no one will be the aristocracy, and no one will be the peasant. And that is communism. That's the end point that we're working towards as Marxists. For this to happen, of course, you have to move from industrialization to that socialism thing. And for that, you need a proletariat, a working class who are big and strident and organized, and they're going to rise up and have a revolution. Now, Russia, of course, didn't have one of these. And even as far back as 1903, they'd begun to wonder about how could it work in Russia. Lenin was part of this discussion. And in 1903, there was a split in the party that was in over how this would happen. Lenin said, what we need to do is organize the revolution on behalf of the proletariat. And we will do that by having a small, professional, revolutionary group. Now, actually, at the time, this group was the bigger in the split, and so they're called the majority party or the Bolsheviks. But of course, in the next 15 years, 14 years up to 1917, they remain quite a small group because they want to be small and elite and professional. The minority group in that debate were called the Mensheviks, and they become more popular because they think that what you need to do is to work alongside the bourgeoisie and have a slower process. But in 1917, Lenin and the Bolshevik Party organize and create a revolution. Some would say it's a coup, just seizing power at the top, but a revolution where they take power and establish what becomes known as the Soviet Union. At this point, Lenin has a number of massive problems already on his plate. We've already flagged up that the war was going very badly. The economy is in dire straits, partly because of the war, and the knock-on effect of that is that food supply is in big trouble. They're a small political party based in Petrograd, with some bases in Moscow, but really, in a tiny part, a well-populated but tiny part of the Russian Empire. The other political parties resent them taking control. And of course, their bigger problem across the whole country is that they don't have support of a big number of people. And these are the issues that Lenin needs to face immediately in 1917, or else the Bolshevik Party would lose power. We'll look at those next time. Thanks for watching. See you then.